Yiboneh, Yiboneh Hamikdash, Yitzion, Yitzion, Yitzion Temaneh. Yiboneh, Yiboneh, Yiboneh Hamikdash, Yitzion, Yitzion, Yitzion Temaneh. Yeshama shir chadash.
Okay, Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Welcome back to the Yiboneh Beit Midrash. Welcome home to Torah. A warm welcome home to Torah. We're in Deuteronomy. Now, Devorim, Parashat Devorim, always falls out on the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av. It's so sad, right? It's so sad. Well, guess what? I'm going to sum up what the Yakar says up until the point where we're going to begin. We're going to begin on really page 3 of the notebook, but for those that got it in advance, it's really page 2, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so basically I want to tell you some background to Deuteronomy in the beginning, what the Yakar has to share. It's unbelievable. If you look on my English note, number 1, right? Very, I would say, fundamental, foundational points about rebuke, about what this parsha is about. Just keep in mind that it begins by telling us seemingly a geographical location that Moses is speaking to them. The whole of Deuteronomy is the last 5 weeks of Moses' life, and that's when he feels, and I'm using the word feels, right, intellectually knows that this is the best time to give rebuke to the people. He will not be bringing them into the land of Israel. He wants to give them strength. He wants to guide them in the correct manner, in his last breaths, so to speak. So one of the things we find, and we look in Rashi, but let's read the first verses. These are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan concerning the wilderness, concerning the Arava, opposite the Sea of Reeds, between Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Chatzerot and Dizahav. Goes on, the 11 days from Choreb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea, and then it says it was in the 40th year, on the first of the month, when Moses spoke to the children of Israel. So one thing to have in mind, verse 1 and 2, Moses is speaking to Israel. Verse 3 and onward, he's speaking to the Bnei Yisrael. Notice that, because that's going to be important. Number 1, the first thing that Rashi mentions is that some of these places never existed geographically. And what they are hints, ramazim. The way a leader needs to give over rebuke to certain types of people are through hints. And so Israel is like a nickname for Yaakov, meaning the leaders, the righteous ones, the most righteous ones of them. They don't need to know it was in the 40th year, the day before the month before he died. That's important to know. And it was through hints. So some of these places, either they actually sinned at, or they allude to sins. Okay? The other thing, just to keep in mind, when he speaks to Bnei Yisrael, you can notice in chapter 1, when you get to verse, let's say 19, he speaks very much about the spies, right? And then, of course, later on, he's also very explicit about the sin of the golden calf. So basically, it's like this. When he speaks the first 2 verses, it's a hinted way, speaking to Yisrael, the leaders, the righteous ones, without the need to mention that I'm about to die. Because you know why? Because righteous people are interested in rebuke at all times. Right? When you start a story, the question the Yakar asks is, why is it only told to us in verse 3 that it was in the 40th year? Right? Wouldn't that be how you start a story? When I was young, all stories began with once upon a time. Right? Or on a letterhead, the very first thing you put is a date. Right? Even documents. Everything seems to be dated. So you begin a story. It's very nice. The geographical locations are very nice. That's where he spoke, between here and there, which is also very odd. What do you have? Like, you have to triangulate where it was, like giving all these different kind of locations, and then you know exactly where it was. Well, look at Rashi right there in the very beginning. Since these are the words of rebuke that Moses enumerates here all the places they angered the omnipresent. Therefore, it makes no explicit mention of the incidences in which they transgress, but rather merely alludes to them by mentioning the names of places out of respect for Israel. I want to keep going because Rashi says like this. He's telling us between Paran and Tophel and Lavan, Rabbi Yochanan mentions they looked through the entire Torah. Of course, Paran is mentioned, but where's Tophel and Lavan? They don't even exist. However, the explanation is, according to Rashi, brings it down through the oral Torah, that this was foolish things that they said about the man. Okay, we know that they complained about the man. If you go to Numbers chapter 21, verse 5, it says, Nafshenu kotzabo lechem haklokel, right? Our souls were disgusted by this ruinous bread. So you see that these places didn't really necessarily exist, yet this was all part of what we call rebuke. So now, I just want to keep summing up some of the important lessons that we're going to skip. We're not going to focus mainly on a lot of these things, although we will mention them in passing. Okay, so I think we talked about point 1 and point number 2. Part of number 2 is the first 2 verses, they address Israel, whereas the remaining verses are addressed to Bnei Yisrael. So another important lesson that Moses is giving before he dies is to the leadership of how to give rebuke. I'm rebuking you, and simultaneously the way I'm doing it is you should learn from me and do the same when you give rebuke. Do it in a hinted fashion, number 1. Also, do you realize that if you don't rebuke them, actually, let me continue. How and when. So another thing is, when should rebuke be given? Before you die. Why? Why is that most accepted? Because the problem when giving rebuke is many times, and I'm guilty. I'm sure that you guys may feel you have also transgressed this. Someone gives you rebuke, and you turn around and look at them like, what happened? You fell out of the sky? Who are you to give me rebuke? You're not perfect yourself. In fact, I saw you do the exact same thing the other day. Or you're worse than me. As the Gemara describes a certain example where someone says, excuse me, sir, you have a toothpick sticking out of your head. And the guy turns around and says, I have a toothpick? You have a beam. You have a pole sticking out of your head, right? Isn't that a very common response, unfortunately? Well, guess what? This is something that if you're on your deathbed and you give rebuke, the person hearing the rebuke is likely not to come back. First of all, maybe out of respect that you're on your way out, but also they don't feel you're going to keep attacking them. They don't feel attacked in the same way if you're young and you're giving rebuke. And also, it's important to know that even if you think the person's not going to listen to you, that's not a reason not to give rebuke. You have an obligation. It's one of the 613 commandments. In fact, it actually follows the command, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Right? In the same paragraph right there. Right? Look it up. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And then it says, rebuke your fellow and not carry his sin. So if you say, well, they're not going to listen to me anyway, well, that's not an excuse. You must fulfill your obligation. Number 3, there are ramifications for not giving rebuke. The most important ramification is that if you're in a position where you could give rebuke and you don't, you carry the sin of the people on your shoulders. Okay? Number 4, know that righteous people who are trying to work on their character, they're working to refine their character because they know what the whole purpose of life is about. As the Vilna Gaon says, what is the tachlit? What's the purpose of our life? Is tikkun hamidos, is to work on our character, to refine our character. Therefore, if someone gives rebuke to you, you should actually be thanking them. Another idea is that before you give rebuke, you should have worked a little bit, maybe a lot, on it yourself. In other words, if you have that issue. If you don't have that issue, I get it. You don't have to work on it yourself. But basically, ornament yourself before you ornament others. In other words, beautify yourself first before you try to beautify others. Remember, the purpose of rebuke is to improve the other person, right? Not out of anger. It has to be done out of love. As I mentioned earlier, right after it says, V'ahavta l'reich chamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, then you have the mitzvah of rebuke. Obviously, there's a lesson here. It shouldn't be done out of anger, resentment, grudge, or whatever, any negative feelings. There's two more points I want to mention. One more. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. This thing called projection. There's a few important statements in Chazal that where you find something agitating, it really rubs you the wrong way in the other person, it's usually something you need to work on yourself. It's a certain character trait that you may not be aware of, but subconsciously you know that it's wrong and it really bothers you, and that could be why you're actually focusing in on the other person. Again, there are obviously cases where the person is wrong and you're not at all guilty of even a dust particle of that particular character trait. But in most cases, or in many cases, and this is going to help us make our own cheshbon hanefesh, which we're obligated to do. We're supposed to make an accounting of our souls. So before we go to sleep at night, when we think about, or during the day when it comes up that something that somebody did that really bothered us, the best thing is to focus on yourself and wonder why Hashem put this situation in your path, right, as perhaps a wake-up call for you, as perhaps like putting your own self under a microscope. Examine yourself, because if you realize that it really bothered you, perhaps this is a reason why you think it's the other person's problem, but really, in a lot of cases, it's your own problem. And that's going to be the main lesson we're going to discuss through this class. So what I want to do, I think I pretty much covered the first page and a half. So we're going to go to page. Everyone knows here. It's the third page. On the Skype, it's the second page. So it's Tuf Reish Pei Gimel, and we're like 8 lines down. It's a new paragraph. Interestingly enough, you have to hear the language in Hebrew. When Moses says, these are the words, Elo Devorim asher diber Moshe al kol Yisrael be'ever Yarden ba'midbar ba'arava mult sof. Okay, now he says, Bein Paran u'bein Tofel. Why do you have to say all the way through this place, that place, this place, and all of a sudden Bein u'bein? Bein u'bein means between and between. But if you say Beini Beini, it means between. Okay, so Bein u'bein somehow means between here and between there. Okay, so he's focusing on that because remember we said the whole thing was a hint. Now, he does take umbrage, he takes some, I'm not going to say he comes to a fight with Rashi. He says, you know what, Rashi claimed that it was something to do with the man. Tofel, right, we saw that first Rashi. It's somehow a hint to the complaints the Jewish people made against the manna. It tasted like cardboard, right? If you had to eat cardboard every day, I think you would complain too, right? Styrofoam. Okay, but the truth is, it really tasted like whatever you wanted it to taste like. But nevertheless, it probably had the texture of cardboard or styrofoam. He begins this paragraph by telling us this idea of Bein u'bein is what? He wants to add his own thoughts to the idea. And he's going to say, if Rashi would have used a certain concept, it's a certain verse, a certain proof to talk about the man, I would have fell in line with Rashi. But I feel, and I'm using the word that loosely, I shouldn't say feel, I know intellectually that it's talking about idol worship. And we're going to plug in the 9th of Av and the 17th of Tammuz as bookmarks or bookends or borders for what it means Bein u'bein, meaning between Paran, and that's the place where the spies were sent from, and Tofel is a representative of idol worship, meaning the 17th of Tammuz is the very day that we worshipped, or let's just say that the golden calf was worshipped, made and worshipped. And therefore, these two concepts are really alluded to. So we'll first go through how he establishes that it's relating to idol worship, and then we're going to get deep into these two, I shouldn't say holidays, they will be holidays, these two bookmarks of time, and how they relate to sins, and obviously we can overcome those sins, and they will turn into great mitzvahs that we can accomplish to overturn all the evil decrees that befall the Jewish people. Now, isn't that an interesting idea? So I'm asking you to stay on board, right? And hopefully we'll learn what we need to do to make a tikkun to fix that which we so easily fall into, idol worship, and let's say sinas chinam, the idea of sending the spies. We're going to find out how this relates to Tisha B'Av and sinas chinam, which is causeless or baseless hatred. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of psychological concepts we're going to talk about today, and let's begin with the Yakar. Bein paran u bein tofel, it's lashon bein u bein. We see the words bein double, twice. So he says, Makom iti lahosif shenis yodi, ulefarsho alma di beini bein shiveser batamos l'tisha b'av. I'm adding a whole nother dimension in order to explain what it means in the meanwhile, and not physically as a geographically, but in terms of time. In terms of in between these two places, as in between the time period between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, which we're in right now. Ki Paran, the actual physical place Paran, is relating to what? The spies, the sin of the spies. Now, obviously, there's a Gemara in Tainus on 29a, speaks about it in depth. Asher bo bachu b'chiyah shel chinam. Okay, let me find it on the source sheet. I think it is number 12 on the source sheet. So we see here, when it says in verse Numbers 14:1, and the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. Right? V'tisa kol ha'eda v'yidnu es kolam v'yavachu ha'am balayla hahu. Rava said that Rav Yochanan said that very night was the 9th of Av. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to them, you wept needlessly that night, and I will therefore establish for you a true tragedy over which there will be weeping in future generations. We're going to talk about the 17th of Tammuz as well. There is a, how do we say it? Maisa avo simin labani. What we did caused a time warp. I don't know if that's the word. But basically caused through time, every year on that date, a similar expression, a similar occurrence, a reason to cry, which we all know, unfortunately, so many horrible and bad things have happened to the Jewish people, both on the 17th of Tammuz and especially on the 9th of Av, through history, because of this original crying that was seemingly, as the verse says, for nothing. Okay, and the word tofel is a hint to Egel Asher Asu, to the golden calf which they made. And according to Rashi, now you'll see where he has umbrage, he has some hesitation, let's say, to go with Rashi's pshat, that toflu is regarding the manna from heaven. And you know why? Because he says we don't really find any example in the Torah of tofel having to do with man. And rather, according to the Yakar, the word Lovan, the place Lovan, that would be a great place because the man itself was white. So Lovan, meaning a place by that name, would make more sense. But he says, you know what? if Rashi would have used a verse in Job, in Eicha, that's Lamentations 6:6, I would have understood it better. In fact, that's would have been a better verse to use. It says over there in Job 6:6, can bland food be eaten without salt? So what's bland? Bland, the word is tafel. Hayachel tafel mivli melach? Can bland food? So in other words, not that the man was necessarily bland, but that was their complaint, right? It really tasted like whatever you wanted. If you didn't have an imagination, it was certainly bland. And like I said, it probably had the same texture. I don't know if that's a big enough complaint because they didn't complain about that per se. But in other words, what did they complain about the man? That would have been a better usage of the term tofel to plug it into the place called tofel. Kikol davar she'ein bo tam, because any food that doesn't have taste is called tafel. Even today, right? We have in the laws of brachot, when we make blessings over food. So there's ikar, there's the main, prime food that you're making the blessing, and then there's the secondary that in a lot of cases, or most cases, a second blessing wouldn't be said because it's called secondary. Tafel means it's bland, it's not really, doesn't have taste. It's not the main point of why you're eating it. And based on that, Zahaya maskim l'divrei Rashi, if he would have used that verse in Job 6:6, I would have certainly agreed with Rashi, but he didn't. So now he begins by telling you his own thoughts. Aval. But, Lefi Darkenu Korov Lishmoa, according to everything I said, it's easier to understand. The Maisa Ego Remez B'Toifel, that the whole idea of the sin of the golden calf is certainly hinted at, and the Remez is in the word Tofel. Why? He says, "Kimatzinu lashon zeba vodazara bekama makomos." We actually find this phraseology, this word used in terms of, let's say, what is idol worship? It's false, isn't it? It's fake news. It's false. So listen to Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 13. It says over there regarding these false prophets, and the prophets in Samaria, I saw unseemliness. In other words, they were false prophets. Uneviaye Shomron Ri'iti Tifla. Falsity. I saw unseemliness, things that are not proper. Hinavu Bibal, right? They prophesied in the name of this idol, the Baal. Also in Eicha, that would be Lamentations 2 verse 14. So it says, Neviaye chazulach shavatafel. Your prophets have seen false and senseless visions. Again, fake news. The idea here is false. It's not real. Tafel. Also in Ezekiel, Yecheskel 13:11, and this is regarding, it's called like whitewashing. What's whitewashing? It's fake, right? You want to sell your house and you have some issues of plumbing or leaks, and you know what you do? You put some plaster on it and then you paint over it and then you sell the house at a high price. Well, you could be sued for that, right? That's crime. It's called whitewashing. It's sticking it under the, basically, we're going to say, it means you're missing the essence, both by, right? You're missing the relationship you could have with God, and then instead you're following these false prophets. It's not true. You're missing the essence. And how do I know? Because then he brings this idea. What was the sin of the golden calf? What did they say? Who's they? Obviously, it was the heir of Rav, the mixed multitudes, right? The Jewish people in mass did not serve the idol. But they said in Exodus chapter 32, verse 4, Ela Elohecha Yisrael. These are your gods, O Israel, who took you up out of Egypt, right? These are your gods. If it was the Jewish people, they wouldn't say these are your gods. They would have said this is our gods, right? So anyway, what is that? That is totally missing that's whitewashing. That's false. That's fake news. Nisnu tifla lelohim. They gave a fake god. That's what the idol was. That's what idols are. Fake. And when did all that take place? We said that was on the 17th of Tammuz, Zeh b'Shiva Asar b'Tammuz. And what happened on that day? That's the day that Moses threw down the luchot. He broke the tablets. Ubo b'yom nishparu haluchos. They were broken. And what does it say in Gemara Tainus on page 26b? Ubekiat avani melu hukba ledoros. Based on that, right? Based on the idea Moses broke the tablets, which are made of stone. Hashem said, your stones will also be crushed and broken. And that was the day that the enemy broke through the walls, the siege. They broke through the walls of Jerusalem, as he mentions here in Hebrew, Hukva choimas ha'ir va'avaneha. Okay, now that we established, we're talking, according to Yakar, Paran and Tofel are talking about 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. So guess what? What do we call this time period? It's called Bein HaMitzarim. And where does that phraseology come from? Look in Eicha, that's Lamentations chapter 1 verse 3. It says over there, Kol rodfeha hisiguhu bein HaMitzarim, which means like this: all of her pursuers, all the pursuers, the enemies of the Jewish people, hisiguha. Hisiguha means they overcome, they overtake. They're going to be victorious over you. Bein HaMitzarim, between the straits. This period that we're in, the 3 weeks, between the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, is called Bein HaMitzarim, between the straits. As we know, Meitzar, is, like from Mitzrayim, is a tight, constricted place, a very narrow place that you have a hard time maneuvering left or right. Okay, so right before that line he says, Ubein shnei gvulim elu, between these two borders, Yisrael roivates, Israel crouches, Bein hamishpatayim, between these edges. It really means like lips, but edges. We're crouching, we're being ambushed, so to speak, and we're crouching down between these two dates. Even though we were talking originally about geographical locations, our hints to specific dates in which these two sins took place. And he says, the Zeh Lashon, now we understand, Beinu Bein. Beinu Bein is not talking about geographical locations, it's talking about in the straits. Bein HaMitzarim. That's what it's talking about, and he brings that verse. And he says, what is that verse referring to? Ki bein chet ha'egel, bein chet ha'maraglim. Between these two sins, that's the sin of the golden calf and the sin of the spies, Korah rovetz. We are crouched we're bent over and crouched. V'dochu lo yochlu kum. We're so pushed, we're so pressured that we're not able to stand up, right? That's the idea. We're in this tight place that it's very difficult for us to stand up. But we must. Israel will stand up, okay? There's a promise. The question is, how are we going to do it? So we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it right now. How are we going to overcome this? So he begins this next paragraph by telling us that there's a thing called supernatural salvation. Now, the word Hatzalah means rescue. But I know that we're more, I'm going to use the word salvation, but you understand we're talking about in a rescue situation. There's a supernatural way, and then there's a natural way. It's unbelievable what he's about to tell us. Ki b'derech hateva, the way nature works. Ein Hatzalah mipnei akat oyev. There's no way that you could be saved, right, rescued from an oppressive enemy, ki im be'echad mishnei drachim, except in one of two ways. He's going to give us two ways, or both of them together. O bishneim ke'echad. So keep in mind, if you can't do them both, at least do one. Okay, and what are these ways to be saved? Who doesn't want to be saved? Okay, we're not talking about like the way the Christians talk about it. So here we go. Hein mitzad hashkachat Hashem yisbrach. One way for salvation to be rescued is the direct intervention of the creator of the universe, the Almighty. Hashem, may he be blessed. Hamatzi l'kol devekim bo. You know what? He will save those who cling to him, those who are intimate in terms of their relationship and open to this relationship with him. Af im einan atzumim beteva. Even if they're not physically strong, even if they don't have the physical stamina. Mekol makom. Nevertheless, kshein mekayamim. When one fulfills the mitzvah, you'll find this mitzvah in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God. If you know how to do that, love the Lord your God, it means you're open to this relationship. And you are clinging to him, and he will cling to you, and then he will save you. Listen to this. Hagoyrim, if you fulfill this mitzvah of loving the Lord your God, it would cause dveikus b'Hashem yisbarach. It actually causes you to cling to Hashem. Azhu matzil l'kol dveikim bo, and he will in return save all those who are clinging. And I don't know if the word clinging is, it sounds weird. Cleaving, having this intimate relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu. We call it dveikus. So if those are more familiar with the word dveikus, you don't need to translate it. You know what it means. It's that intimate relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu. And then what about from a natural? Let's say you did not fulfill the Ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. You didn't have such a strong relationship with God. But what did you work on? You worked on another mitzvah in Leviticus chapter 19:18, where it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. V'ahavta l'recha chamocha. So he begins by telling us from a natural standpoint, when one fulfills that mitzvah, then what's the result? What are the consequences? They're very positive. As ish esre'eu ya'azoru, that each person will help his friend. Right? If you're a nice guy, you work on your character, you're not a Jerk. I don't know who's listening, right? You know how to spell, right? If you're not like nasty, you really are doing your best to be a nice person and helping others, what goes around comes around, as we say, right? And if God forbid you needed a loan and you needed someone to either lend you the money or co-sign for you in the bank, so if you were out for other people and you were selfless, it could very well be that people will come to your rescue, to your help as well. And guess what he says? This is unbelievable. Af im chem chotim. Even if they're sinners. Remember, he's removed himself from the dveikus of Hashem for some reason. I don't know why or how, but he's really worked on his bein adam lechavero. He's worked on his interpersonal relationships to the point that he's a really nice, or she's a really nice person. Guess what? Even if they're away from Hashem, they have removed Hashem from upon themselves. Mikom makom yeshlem katzat tikva. There's a little bit of hope. There is a glimmer of hope. B'derech hateva, in just a natural fashion. But he does make a caveat. And I'm not sure how to best translate this. Remember, every translation is an interpretation. My interpretation of the next few words are, Imlo titnaged lehem amaracha. Provided the person did not really upset the apple cart, that the person did not go against the system. That's the literal translation. So what I think it means, there's certain communal norms that you didn't go, you weren't ostracized, you weren't excommunicated, you didn't do anything that horrible. You were basically still decent. So in other words, even if you were a sinner and you didn't have that close relationship with Hashem, but you were doing and fulfilling the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself, so there was a little bit of hope. There is some hope on a natural level. Now, I hope I explained that well enough. Bishnei Zmani Melu. Back to these two ideas, these two time periods, the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. Ivdu Yisrael Shneim Kechad. We lost. I mean, I feel like crying when I say it. We lost both aspects of any kind of salvation, of any kind of rescue. And he's going to relate how we did that with both the golden calf and the sin of the spies. And if that's the case, if we lost both aspects of any hope of salvation from either Hashem directly or from other people, im kain el mi yenusu la'ozra, who would you turn to? Who could you possibly turn to? I know people, they sell their self to the devil, right? They sell their soul to the devil. Okay, so we're talking about salvation here. You only have a choice. Hashem, other people, or both, right? Now, what happened on the 17th of Tammuz, B'Shivas B'Tammuz? We made the Ego, or the Ego was made, Bo B'Yom Nozru Achor. That means that we turned away. We turned backwards from Hashem. That was the point. Remember, we talked about Hashgacha of Chadash Baruch Hu, the direct intervention. If we turn ourselves away, He'll also allow us to be turned away, right? Like God says later on, that if you treat me like happenstance, then I'll treat you like happenstance, b'mikreh, okay? But you treat everything that happens as intervention of Hashem, I'll be in your life. So here we did, by making the ego, we turned away. Upanu el Hashem yisbrach oiref v'lo panim. He says we turned the back of our necks, the oref. That's what we did. Now wait till you hear this, right? There are constellations in the sky. In Judaism, we don't believe in them. We transcend them. They exist. We don't have to believe in them. God created the stars, and the non-Jews, sorry to say, are mainly under the stars. Mainly. Of course, you can get out of it too. Like us. Cling to the Jewish people. Cling to Hashem Yisbarach. Go beyond. But basically, that month of Tammuz is what? Is the crab. And we were acting like the crab. Because what does the crab do? I don't know, it's a he or she. The crab walks backwards. The crab walks sideways. I've never seen a crab run a straight line. That's not how they do it. Okay? So that's what we were doing. We were acting like the crab. Shedarko leilech lachorav. Its way is to walk backwards. Kach nozru achor. That's what we did. We followed that. As ivdu hatzala habad mipas hashgacha. And therefore we lost that possibility of rescue of Hashem's personal intervention. Because we turned away from God. Now what about Tisha B'Av? This is a little bit more complicated. Because we all know that it was the sin of the spies. They spoke Lashon Hara about the land. And what in the world does that have to do with what? With Sinas Chinam. You ever ask yourself? I'm sure you lost many hours of sleep. Right? Come on, you won't be able to sleep tonight either if you turn this off. Right? What does Sinas Chinam have to do with being disgusted with the land of Israel? Well, I would ask you for a drum roll. Aaron, you want to give us a drum roll? There you go. You can do better than that. Okay, everyone together, all at the same time. Come on, there you go. All right. Okay, here we go. On Tisha B'Av, Hayamase Harmaraglim. On Tisha B'Av, we had what? The situation, the sin of the spies. And what happened? Wait till you hear this. He says, Bo b'yom nolada midas sinas chinam Yisrael. How? We're gonna hear how hatred for another Jew was born, came into the world on this day. Ready for this? Psychology. I said in the beginning, we're going to talk about projecting. Okay, there's two concepts. One is projecting and one is called transference. Projecting is when I feel a certain way about you and I'm projecting that this is how you feel about me. Transference is when you have a feeling about me and I transfer it into my feelings. Okay, so we're talking about projection. It starts with me. My feelings about you, I imagine you feel about me. We're going to start with a verse in our chapter. Chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, verse 27. What does it say? This is Moses speaking to them. He says, you slandered in your tents and said, I can't even believe we said this. Because of Hashem's hatred for us, did he take us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of the enemy, the Amorites, to destroy us. Now, we kind of skipped over some of these verses, but there were quite a few verses where we said, Hashem, we didn't say God hates us, but we said, why did you bring us up? To die in the wilderness? We had it better off in Egypt. Let's go back. What could be going through a people's mind to say such a thing, that we were better off in Egypt? Why'd you bring us up here to die? And here you have it. They said, the Jewish people said, Moses is quoting us, that God hates us. That's why he took us out of Egypt. You guys have ever seen this verse? You've read the Bible. This is what we said. What was going through our minds? How could we have said that God hates us? When you know what? The truth is, he doesn't hate us. He says over and over again, with an eternal love, I have such love for you. You're my firstborn. You, the Jewish people, my firstborn. Right? I love all my creations. Right? And yet there's a special love that I have for you. How could we, after experiencing the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea, gathering all that gold and having it wash ashore on the sea, on the edge of the sea, and having the cloud of glory protect us, and having the water, the rock that poured forth water, follow us around. I can go on and on, right? The man from heaven, the quail, the meat, whatever it was, we were healed. Every Jew that stood at Mount Sinai was physically healed. If we were lame, if we were blind, if we were deaf, if we had any illness, we were healed. Nobody died. We didn't even need to go to the bathroom. We didn't have to change our clothes. Right? Imagine what it's like to do laundry, let alone in the desert. It's a tough job. Give the people who do the laundry a lot of credit. Right? And to cook the meals, you didn't have to cook. What chesed, what kindness God had for us. How could we have said, God hates us? Yet we said it. So Rashi says something absolutely amazing over there in that verse. He says, and I'll say it, it's Aramaic, because he's quoting from something else. Ma divlibach al rachamach, ma divlibei alach, which again translates as, what is in your heart about your friend is really what you imagine is in his heart about you. Okay, so if you have hate in your heart, then you imagine that your friend hates you. This is key in terms of doing cheshbon and nefesh, right? To take an accounting of your soul. As soon as you accuse someone else of anything, immediately ask yourself, is it possible that this is something that I have within me that really bothers me? It may be objectively true, the other person has that character trait. But what about me? How come I'm the one that it bothers so much? Everyone I speak to, they don't notice it, or it doesn't bother them so much. But it bothers the heck out of me. It's because I have that issue, and I need to work on it. But whatever it is that I imagine, whatever I actually have in my heart, I imagine that that's what is in his heart about me. So here he goes. This is what they were thinking. This is what the Jewish people were thinking. Me'achar shekol echad mehem sonis chavero. This is like a given. It must be that each one actually hated his own friend. Meaning within my heart, I already had the hate. Therefore, what did I think about God? Remember, God is my friend. When it says, love your neighbor as yourself, it's not only your physical neighbor and your friend, it's your greatest friend of all, which is Hashem as well. But if you think about your friend hates you, and Hashem is your friend, so what are you going to think? You're going to think that God must hate you. Why else would you say, and they said it, God hates us. And they said, why did he bring us up here to die? Why didn't we had it better in Egypt? We had cantaloupes and watermelon and cucumbers, right? And garlic and free fish. So that's the basis for what he's saying. And not only that, once you make this grave mistake, after you've come to this incorrect conclusion that God hates you, what happens as a natural result, the consequence is, the hate just continues to spread. And based on that, the tire tzara zu, I just want to mention, one of my chavrusas mentioned that, remember, we're supposed to follow and imitate the nature of God, right? The character traits of God. So he wanted to say, and I didn't want to really go with this, but I'll tell it anyway. He says basically why it would be a natural consequence that you would hate your friend is because if God hates you and you're supposed to imitate God, the natural obligation you would feel in imitating God would also to be hate. I find that too hard to believe, but okay, let's just say that's a legitimate understanding. I think it's just a natural consequence. The hate is, and we're going to see it a little bit later, about mitzvah, a mitzvah goreret mitzvah, a sin is also goreret sin. Avera goreret avera. It's like the way you want to go, Hashem will help and lead you in that direction. And therefore, if you already hated within your heart, and then you, like misery loves company, you think everyone else hates each other, so then hate will just fester and continue to grow. But anyway, he makes third line down a very important point. He says, this was conceived. Vitahar is like conception in terms of birth, but he also means like conception in terms of like an idea. So he says, V'ta tzara zu, v'teled mida razu, that it was conceived in pain, this concept, which is painful enough, was teled, gave birth to this horrible trait, this evil trait. And now he says this is the reason for the destruction of both temples, the temple number 1 and temple number 2. Now we all know temple number 1, Bayit Rishon, was destroyed because of the 3 great sins, the 3 cardinal sins: murder, adultery, and idolatry. But he's saying no, it's sinas chinam. So now we have another pill we need to swallow, right? You want the red pill or the blue pill? Which are you going to take? You want the truth? Wait till you hear this. Bayit Rishon hayasinas chinam de niseya Yisrael. That in the first temple, you cannot deny this. I mean, there's plenty of verses to prove it. In the Gemara Yuma, chapter 9, page 9b. But basically, it started out with a hatred between the princes, between the leaders. As we know, yes, Shlomo Melech was overtaxing the people, perhaps, but nevertheless, the leadership decided, we're going to make a king, we're going to separate. They even made their own temples, they made idols, and they prevented the Jews from going to Yehuda, to the temple in Jerusalem. And it really started with a hatred or jealousy or honor of the leadership. And based on that, as he will say, as time progressed, it only got worse and it spread out like cancer by the time the second temple. So it began with the leadership. Don't think there was any sinas chinam. The sinas chinam was not amongst the people per se, but it was reason for the destruction itself. As he says, Ki bebayit rishon, there was the sinas chinam amongst the Nesiya Yisrael. Bayit sheni, paso hanega, the disease spread, bein kol Yisrael, amongst the rest of the Jewish people. Now, Zaya b'chodesh Av. When did this all take place? The month of Av. What is the astrological sign for the month of Av?
Lion.
The lion, the Aryeh. What does an Aryeh do besides sleeping? He tears apart his enemies. That's what he does. Hayachodesh Av Shemaz Lo Aryeh. The constellation is the constellation of the lion. Ki kol echad dimyono ka'aryeh. That each person imagine himself like an Aryeh, like a lion. Yiksof liktrof es chavero, who tears apart and destroys his friend. And then what happens when you do that? That falls in line, the opposite of ahavta re'echa kamocha. Love your neighbors yourself, right? Then you lose that salvation or that possibility of rescue in the natural way. When you don't have love between each other, each person is not helping his friend. And there's a verse in Amos, Prophet Amos 7 verse 2, describes Yaakov as being very small and has no merits. So mi Yakum Yaakov, how is Yaakov supposed to get up? Ki katan vadalhu, when he's so poor, meaning he has no mitzvahs. He's poor in mitzvahs. He's not doing chesed. That's one of the things that I'm just going to take a short little break here and mention about what Yiboneh does. We organize chesed projects, right? So, listen, we only have two things before Mashiach comes: Torah and chesed. So who wouldn't want to get involved in supporting Yiboneh? Come to Israel, learn with us, sit in this very room, right? You have an opportunity, and you can do chesed projects and learn Torah. Because really, that's all there is. That's all there is. Anyway, back to the last paragraph we're going to talk about today. It comes out, Nimsa, Shebein Gvulim Elu, between these two time periods, between these two bookends, Nitparada Chachavila Mikol V'Kol. Whatever package we had, whatever help we had, whatever hope we had of salvation, totally came apart. Right? You have a bow on top of a box, it's a package, you unravel the package. And it was unraveled, Kisaro Meher Min Hashem. We ran away from God. We quickly turned away. V'saro Gam Ish Me'al Achiv. During these two time periods, we also ran away not only from Hashem, but from each other, from each person. We turned our backs against our fellow human being. Nimsa comes out that on the 17th of Tammuz and on Tisha B'Av, that's called a Geder Mizeh v'Gader Mizeh. It's like a fence on both sides of us. We're squished Bein HaMetzarim, between these two straits, between the straits. Ein derech lintois yaminu small, and there's no way we can move neither right or left. And going back to that verse, I think it was in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 3, right? Kol rodfeha hisiguha beina mitzarim. Listen to this. That's when all of your enemies, it says kol, we're going to see what the word kol means. All of her pursuers overtook her bein hamitzarim during this time period. What does the word kol mean? Kol means all. What does all mean? All! Every one of your enemies. Even the weakest of your enemies. Why? Because you ran away from Hashem. And you ran away from Bein Adam Chavero. You ran away from the possibility of doing a hafez as Hashem Elokecha. Love the Lord your God. You had the opportunity to love your neighbors yourself. But you ran away, and there's what's left. It's mashma, filu roidith, koldu, chalush, yocholehem. It comes out based on that verse. The word all means what? You know who's going to run after you? Even the weakest, because it says kol, all of your enemies, any of them, even the weakest of them can overcome you. Ki bezman echad ni'atzu es kadosh Yisrael. The word natz, right? Nazi means to provoke Hashem. Interesting, right? So at that time, Bizman Echad, at that one moment, we provoked or angered, either it means Kadosh Yisrael, the sanctity of the Jewish people. That is Hashem himself, or everything that we stand for, all the possibility of these mitzvahs. And Chilulu Kadushat Yisrael Taloi Be'achto Sa'uma. We desanctified, we actually desecrated this holiness of the Jewish people that is totally dependent, hanging on the unity of the nation. The unity, Achdus Yisrael. Everything depends on that. Ubizman sheni nazaru achar min hashchina. So everything we talked about up until now for the last few minutes was about the 9th of Av. Guess what? What about the other time period called the 17th of Tammuz? That's when we turned away from the Shechina. We turned away from Hashem. El mi yenusu la'ozra. Then who would help us? Al kain amar Moshe b'tochacha zu. This is why Moses spoke out this type of rebuke. Ra'u ki atem oimdim. He's telling you, you are standing here between these two pillars, between these two gvulim, between these two bookmarks called the 17th of Tammuz. Remember, between Paran and Tophel. Tophel is the 17th of Tammuz. Paran is the spies, meaning the sin, which caused what? Listen to this. He's telling us, you're standing here, bein shnei gvulim, elu, bein hamitzarim. He's telling us you're standing in this time period right now. Mitzad masei paron and masei tophel, between these two sins. Ukedei lezarzam ala tshuva, and he wanted to encourage them, to get them to be fervorous and passionate about doing tshuva. Amar kain, that's why he said everything he said in verse 1 and 2. Ki im lo yeshuvu, because if you don't do tshuva, as maseh shel paran, then the sin of the spies is going to come and haunt you in the future. Yikba lehem b'chil adoros. It's going to come and cause you to have what to cry about in the future generations. Ki bo ma'asu be'eretz kedosha, because you were disgusted by the land of Israel. That's really what happened. We spoke about that. Akin yedinam legalos mimena, and that's why the result of wanting, being disgusted by the land of Israel, the result is exile. Right, measure for measure, you would be exiled from that land. Kasher be'emet, and the truth is, galu b'Tisha b'Av, we were exiled on Tisha b'Av. Ub'maisa toifel yisavavu b'kiyat ha'ir b'shivas b'tamuz, and because of the sin of the golden calf, that's what caused the walls of Jerusalem to be broken through on the 7th of Tammuz. And by the way, in today's news, or maybe it was yesterday, they found wall from the first temple, and they found ash, they found a lot of things. You have to go to the news sites to hear what they found. No coincidence. Baini. In the meanwhile, in that time period, Yirbetzu bein hamishpatayim, that the Jewish people are crouched in this, between these two borders. Oyev kodu yardifame, and the enemy is able to overcome us, and any of our enemies. We need to think seriously how every day of the year, not just during the 3 weeks, right? Every day of the year. Do we want this salvation of Hashem? And do we, of course, we require the salvation of the Jewish people as well, right? We are part of the Jewish people. Now, I'm going to do hopefully, I don't know when, maybe in 2 weeks, maybe before then. We're going to talk about the Shema soon. So I just want to mention about the Shema. It's a beautiful piece. I might have mentioned it last week or the week before. But when we say Shema Yisrael, great questions asked. Why do we have to say Shema Yisrael? Why don't we just say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? What prompts us to have to, because the verse says so. Very nice. So we want to unify Hashem and we say, listen, O Israel. Who am I talking to? When I say it, I'm talking to all of you. We're all reminding each other. Because what are we doing when we say the Shema? We're accepting upon ourselves the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Correct? The yoke, the responsibility of bringing the world of God down into this world. Well, guess what? It can only be done by Kol Yisrael. Kol Yisrael, Klal Yisrael. Right? Because a king without a people is not a king. I can accept upon myself a master. Great. But we're talking about the kingdom of heaven. We're talking about accepting. So I need every Jew. If I want to be religious, and I want to be so holy, and I want to have ecstasy, and I want to go up to a mountain and be by myself, that's not going to work. If I want that ecstasy and I want to have that religious experience, I need every one of you. And you need every one of us. Because that is Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. He is our God. But anyway, this is like a tease, a taste, to hear in a few weeks when we talk about the Shema itself. Hopefully I'll go deeper into the Sefer that I'm reading. There's 2 shorter paragraphs, but we're not going to go into that. And I want to just wish everybody, I hope we'll be feasting and not fasting on Tisha B'Av. It's still a possibility. Mashiach can come. And B'ezrat Hashem. But I think that, I'm talking for myself, that the lessons we learned tonight, we really take to heart. One of the things I mentioned in the beginning, I wish the people could learn Hebrew, right? I had a hard time, right? So I know how hard it is. So I put on the website, there's a link down below for these sheets without the colors, just plain sheets, and without the English. If you want to join us, right, you can send me an email. There's also a link to there, and we'll send you the English sheets as well, right? So, and hopefully you'll join us actually like these brave people on Skype. Anyway, so what we say at the end is always have a great life. So have a good Shabbos, and B'ezrat Hashem, have a meaningful fast if we have to fast, and if we have to feast, have an extremely meaningful feast. B'ezrat Hashem. Kol Tuv. Now questions on the
Yiboneh,